The United States has presidential elections upcoming, in November to be exact, and Iran has had a draft resolution passed against it by the United Nations nuclear watchdog, or IAEA. But Iran and the IAEA have enjoyed meticulous relations since the nuclear deal of 2015. So what went wrong? By way of the JCPOA nuclear deal, the UN arms embargo on Iran terminates in October 2020. US presidential elections are upcoming and President Trump doesn't have much to show for his term in office. So he's putting a new spin on sanctions against Iran, it would seem. And he's not alone. Who's at his side and how can he extend sanctions beyond the deal? For answers and to join loose ends, stay with me, Leila Faromarzi, on Iran Today. Israel is the word. It would not be the first time Donald Trump turns to a foreign country for help in boosting support at home. This time, Israel came to the rescue, it would seem. Itself an outlaw with the UN, Israel claims it has evidence of suspicious nuclear activity in 2 Iranian sites. Suspicious activity when? In the early 2000s, way before the nuclear deal by which Iran committed to limit its nuclear program. Anyhow, based on these allegations, the IAEA has drafted a resolution against Iran, demanding access to the 2 now defunct sites. Mr. Ghafourifard says whether the IAEA is acting in keeping with its professional norms or is being pushed by an American ulterior motive. Why now?
They
are required to offer reasons when they intend to inspect any site. It would not be acceptable to rely on news relayed from Israel or any other country. I think it would be a dangerous move, which would downgrade the IAEA from an expert organ to a political lever against nations which have problem with the US. That poses a big threat. The deputy head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran has issued warning to that effect. The IAEA is supposed to be a nuclear expertise organ for the entire world. The 2 sites whose inspection they have requested runs counter to Clause 4C of the NPT Additional Protocol.
So, a resolution can lead to prolonged sanctions, which goes against the very grain of the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That deal was to lift economic UN sanctions off Iran so that Iran would curb its peaceful nuclear program. That Iran did, but for little gain and a lot of pain. Mr. Ojorlu is both editor-in-chief of Mosallas magazine and teaches political science. He tells of the nature of the IAEA draft resolution and report. Would you say the IAEA is acting according to its own professional norms or acting under the influence of the US in drafting a resolution against Iran?
It's an attempt to bring Iran back to negotiations. I think this resolution could finally set the stage for fresh talks with a view to signing a second JCPOA. You must have seen that immediately after this resolution was adopted, both Brian Hook and President Trump spoke about talks, saying they are ready for any agreement with Iran. This case may be seen and analyzed from a political and security standpoint.
Mr. Ghafourifard, nuclear expert and former MP, tells of how 6 IAEA experts at a time were present in Iran since the nuclear deal. 6 a day for 365 days a year makes over 2,000 a year. Sounds like espionage. But at the same time, 21% of all IAEA inspections have been conducted on Iranian sites since, and Iran has come out with flying colors since. At least 15 times between 2015 and 2019, the IAEA confirmed Iran's full compliance with the deal. This is while the US unilaterally pulled out of that multilateral international deal between Iran and the 5 permanent UN Security Council members, the P5+1.
It was clear that the United States could not tolerate any power emerge in a strategic region like West Asia, where the US has so many interests. It was clear that the US would remain committed to this treaty as long as its interests were safeguarded. As soon as it felt its interests were threatened, and Iran has become a political, scientific, intellectual and ideological power, despite all restrictions, it would try its best to harm Iran, because it sticks with its own interests only.
Now, to get back to Trump's sanctions on Iran and the UN sanctions he wants to extend beyond the deal. I said the excuse was that Iran hadn't granted the agency access to two defunct but marked sites. Now imagine this, you get a knock at the door. It's the police wanting to search your house because a neighbor, an old enemy, has claimed that you have drugs stored away. Would you open the door? Obviously not. Not without a valid warrant by a renowned judge. Questions are routine to the IAEA or International Atomic Energy Agency, but it may put these questions to countries in one of three forms. As 1, safety questions, 2, annual declarations of countries, and 3, new agency questions in regard to the former two options. Questions meaning inquiry. The IAEA is to submit its requests within the framework of the Safeguards Regulations and the Statute of the IAEA. Hearsay and a bunch of what Gharibabadi called commercial satellite imageries that contained no convincing underlying reason hardly sound like solid grounds for search warrants and resolutions targeting the livelihood of a nation that has been the only complying party to the deal in question. Gharibabadi is Iran's UN ambassador in Vienna.
Naturally, when you are a tool in a foreign government's hand and also a part of US-Israeli project, the fake documents they present would be referred to and they would enter the IAEA technical cycle. I think that neither the IAEA nor Europe is an independent actor. The main actor is the US and President Trump, and the rest are US playthings. It has become tangible over the past 2 to 3 years where Europe stands.
Mr. Izadi is Professor of International Studies. Let's hear him out.
That's very bad for the agency because it's supposed to be an agency that deals with technical matters. Whether you are enriching uranium, at what level, how much uranium you have enriched. All the technical issues is supposed to be what the IAEA does. Getting influence from countries that are enemies of Iran is not going to be good for IAEA in the long term. And there are a lot of people in Iran that are talking about ending the cooperation that exists under additional protocol.
Sounds like Iran won't be setting a precedent by granting what it deems unwarranted access to its nuclear or other sites. What makes the issue all the more ludicrous is that the US is demanding triggering the snapback clause of the JCPOA. That is to snap back sanctions on this country. The thing is, the US is no longer party to the nuclear deal as it just pulled out of the deal, illegally, according to experts at large.
Maybe it has been the best time now as Iran's arms embargo is to expire in 2 to 3 months. Trump may be willing to use it as a bargaining chip in the run-up to the upcoming presidential election. The timing of the US presidential election, the ongoing unrest over citizen rights, and mismanagement of the coronavirus pandemic have left no option for President Trump. Therefore, they are looking for a new bargaining chip for election.
We have a history of the United States and the Israelis trying to use the International Atomic Energy Agency to achieve foreign policy goals. And the makeup of the agency sometimes allows them to do that because they put their allies and friends in the governing board to have a majority. Not everybody on the governing board is following US dictates, but there are a good number of countries that, for their own reasons, have to listen to the United States. So it has been, IAEA has been influenced by political pressure.
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. The discussion is endless. Let's take a break for a reboot and seeing what other media outlets have to say. For that, I give you Shahzad.
Hi, my name is Shahzad Manicheri, and this is the news section of Iran Today. We'll be looking online for the latest update on the US's effort to keep Iran under tight sanctions. In an article by The Nation, we witness EU's Big Three seek to dodge JCPOA obligations by applying pressure through IAEA, says Iran. The adoption of a resolution backed by the EU Big Three, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA board demanding that Iran allow IAEA inspectors access to its nuclear facilities is an irresponsible step, Iran Foreign Ministry spokesman Sayed Abbas Mousavi said. The resolution of the Board of Governors is a step completely devoid of anything constructive, as Iran has the highest possible level of cooperation with the IAEA. These countries, the EU Big Three, appear unable to fulfill their obligations under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and they are trying to avoid the obligations by undertaking moves such as this, he said. The Tehran Times reports Iran won't let IAEA breach legal framework as per the parliament speaker. The Speaker of Iran's parliament has deplored the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, for succumbing to the US pressure and passing an anti-Iran resolution, saying the Islamic Republic will never allow the IAEA to violate its legal frameworks. The past 17 years have shown that Iran has always had the best cooperation with the agency in terms of its international regulations and national interests, but often has gained nothing in return except for more hostility and ransom demands, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said during an open session of the parliament. Noting that such pressures are aimed at bringing Iran to the negotiation table to serve the interests of the US and the Israeli regime, he reiterated Iran's firm stance and the diplomacy of active resistance, adding that Iran will never allow Washington and Tel Aviv to materialize their goals in the regional and international areas. The Washington Post claims European powers refuse to back US call for escalating sanctions against Iran. The United States' three closest European allies said on June 19th that they would not support the Trump administration's threat to reimpose UN sanctions on Iran, but they urged Tehran to allow access to two secretive sites where nuclear material may be stockpiled. France, Britain, and Germany, who all negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, alongside the United States, Russia, and China, and have struggled to keep it alive after President Trump withdrew from the accord, also said they wanted to hold talks with Iran over its violations of the agreement. We firmly believe that any unilateral attempt to trigger UN sanctions snapback would have serious adverse consequences in the UN Security Council, the foreign official said in a statement. We would not support such a decision, which would be incompatible with our current efforts to preserve the JCPOA. In an article by Israel Hayom, we take a look into how Turkey embraces Iran once again, defying US. Iran's stability and peace is important for us, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said at a joint news conference with Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. Turkey reiterated its opposition to the US sanctions on neighboring Iran, saying the coronavirus pandemic has shown that the world needs greater cooperation and solidarity. Turkish Foreign Minister made the comments in Istanbul during the joint news conference with his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif, who was the first dignitary to visit Turkey since the outbreak began in March. Zarif said the US had tightened the sanctions in order to damage the Iranian economy during the pandemic. He thanked Turkey for its support. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
The US pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA, on 8 May 2018, and Iran settled for a deal with the P4+1 at the exclusion of the US. But with Europe powerless before US secondary sanctions threatening any European or other company dealing with Iran, Iran started a reversible, phased reduction of its commitments to the deal on 8 May 2019. That was the anniversary of the US pullout. You mentioned the US violating the JCPOA, but that's not the only international agreement the US, Trump's US, has violated, is it?
The US government under the Trump administration does not believe in international organizations. You know how they acted with WTO. In the middle of the pandemic, they cut funding to WTO. They don't believe in science. They don't believe in global warming. That's why they left the Paris Agreement. They don't believe in arms reductions or agreements that they have on non-proliferation. That's why they left the Open Skies Agreement just a few weeks ago. So this is how a dying superpower is acting, is just kicking many of the institutions that the United States was instrumental in building.
Now, Iran is being rebuked by the E3, Western European partners to the deal, at a time when the US is urging UN Security Council members to renew an arms embargo on Iran for violating its obligations under the 2015 deal. However, the violation, according to musings by Israel, dates to years before that nuclear deal was struck.
Israel owns 250 to 300 nuclear warheads. It is not an NPT signatory, and it repeatedly denies having warheads. Their hostility to Iran is clear. Their conspiracies are known to everyone. They killed a number of our nuclear scientists. Now a fake report by this regime is used as evidence to demand inspection of Iranian nuclear sites in total disregard of the NPT additional protocol. That's why I said their request for inspection contradicts Clause 4C.
The Trump administration says it will trigger a return of UN sanctions on Iran if the embargo is not renewed, setting the stage for a fight in the Security Council, as Russia and China are expected to block the return of sanctions. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov criticized the US position. He said Washington cannot move to enforce an international agreement that it has pulled out of. Again, if the US was within its rights in demanding sanctions to snap back on Iran, it wouldn't have to be rallying the IAEA and E3 to put it in writing. Iran, in fact, may make a win by employing the strategy itself, and it does have its supporters within the UNSC Security Council. Two powerful supporters at that, Russia and China.
We are currently implementing the NPT additional protocol voluntarily. We have voluntarily accepted inspections. They intend to take our case to the UN Security Council by using their tools. We also have to do our own lobbying there using Russia and China's potential. The big threat we are faced with is our sanctions-inflicted economic woes that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 outbreak. The government and parliament are required to cooperate to find a solution to this problem. They should not be the enemy of each other. The parliament is required to push the government to work.
The US, however, by bullying its way around, does have more than one option and plan for getting its way. Should snapback sanctions be refuted by the agency and partners to the deal, there are second and third ways forward for America. The second way forward is to take the resolutions to the Security Council and prevent the lifting of sanctions on Iran for various reasons. This is almost impossible for them, however, because China and Russia have shown that they will oppose an illegal resolution of the sort. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov stressed Russia would do everything to preserve a 2015 nuclear deal. The third way for America is to incite Europeans to use the snapback tool. Therefore, if the IAEA announces that Iran has violated the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, the Europeans will have the necessary excuse to do so. It is not clear whether the three Western European powers really want that to happen.
The Europeans are acting in a way that at the end of the day will damage their own foreign policy and foreign objectives. Iran cannot be a party to a multilateral agreement unilaterally. And as you know, the US officially left the nuclear agreement 2 years ago, and the Europeans have left the agreement unofficially because they're not doing anything that they are supposed to be doing. Even issues like INSTEX and other things they have talked about has not really materialized in practice. So we have a situation with Europe, at least a number of European countries, that are expecting Iran to follow the nuclear agreement in full when they are not following it at all, and when the US has officially left the agreement. And that's not really acceptable for Iran.
European diplomats appear to be forging a compromise by proposing a limited extension of the arms embargo on Iran. Because the 5-year ban on conventional arms trade with Iran, which was included in the 2015 nuclear deal, is set to expire on October the 18th, 2020. Are European powers on a quest of their own, working against Iran, or do they really have no choice before US power?
برجام نشون داد که منافع ما در جهت منافع غرب
The JCPOA showed that our interests are not defined within the framework of Western interests. Our interests are different. If one day we sit together for agreement, it would be between two enemies and not two friends. One enemy is a fox-style enemy like Europe seeking to serve the US interests. The other enemy is a wolf-style enemy like Trump. One is trying to deceive us through soft trickeries, and the other one is resorting to hard tools. It was our big lesson from the JCPOA.
Iran is positive toward anyone out to keep the nuclear deal alive, but despite a few steps away from the JCPOA, Iran has done little so far. Here we still show Iran's actions over the past year. Little by way of reducing its commitments, I mean.
Our submission to Chapter 7 will not make sanctions tougher for us. Under the present circumstances, I think that we have no option but to resist Trump. Such resistance will have aspects of honor, identity, national interest, and pragmatism. Then we have to wait and see what would happen in the November election before we can make up our mind. I have to know that should Democrats come to power, sanctions and pressure will not end. Only the form of confronting Iran will change. The wolf will give way to the fox, the US and Europe will become like each other, pushing us to new conditions. They will also be looking for a second JCPOA, but their methods will be naturally different.
At the same time, we note, Iran is allowed to advance enrichment as much as it likes in keeping with its given international rights. This means it can set aside any commitment it's made to the JCPOA, for example, restrictions on the use of centrifuges and heavy water production. In fact, Iran can make a snapback cost the Europeans dearly. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Mousavi said our advice to the E2+1 states, that's the E3 states, is that if they cannot do something to save the deal, they can at least avoid making the situation more complicated and difficult. Paradoxically, your lack of action was needed here, which it seems you couldn't even do this, he told the 3 European powers. Would you say that as a last resort, Iran might actually terminate its membership to the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Iran has said that Iran is not interested in building a nuclear weapon, and at the same time Iran is not interested in all the harassment that they're getting from IAEA. So a lot of people are not seeing any benefit in staying with the NPT, and they want to leave. And I think with the new parliament that is going to have an oversight on this issue, if the other side continues this type of malign behavior, I think the new parliament will decide and pass a law on Iran actually exiting the nuclear proliferation treaty.
And Foreign Minister Zarif objected to the US's illusion that it can expect gains from the nuclear deal when it is not even party to the deal any longer. Zarif displayed a copy of an International Court of Justice ruling in 1971 that reads, "One of the fundamental principles governing the international relationship thus established is that a country which disavows or does not fulfill its own obligations cannot be recognized as retaining the rights which it claims to derive from the relationship." That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Do watch again at the same times next week and each week after, as we will be back to see how well Donald Trump has been doing at imposing and extending sanctions on Iran as an election ploy. In the meantime, don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.